So before introducing our guest, that actually doesn't need this big introduction because you all know him very well, I'm sure. But first of all, I want to thank you for accepting our invitation and for being here. I would like to spend some words on our seminar series. Maybe some of you don't know the series. Some of the today participants already were here presenting their work, so we are kind of family now. So the seminar, this is the last session of our social seminar on social movements and political action. Is the last section of this year, 2020, which was it has been quite different, unpredictable year actually for many reasons. And to conclude this special here, we are really enthusiastic to have Dwight McAdam with us, and this is a very, really fantastic way to close this year seminar. Before presenting our guest and his work and letting the floor, I'd like to spend some few words about the seminar. Britta Baumgarten and I created this seminar in October 2013. And we took inspiration from the seminar created in Lausanne, the Crapu. So thank you, Olivier, if you are there, for the inspiration. And we have hosted until now. I ask you please to turn off your microphone if possible. Just a moment. Yeah, okay. We have had until now more or less 50 sessions in this year, so covering a very wide range of topics related to social movements, conflict, different forms of resistance in different parts of the world. And the idea has always been a little bit to take advantage of the border or maybe bridging situation of Portugal in not only in geographical terms, but particularly in linguistic, epistemological terms, and to be really a country at the crossroad of many different epistemological traditions. So we have had seminars on different forms of conflict or resistance in many different countries, such as former Portuguese colonies in Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Guinea, many presentations on Brazil, and we also try to cross different approaches and different methodologies from ethnographic studies, urban studies, anthropological perspective, etc., social psychology perspective, etc., etc. And also we focus on protest, different forms of protest that are also not so evident, so open in the street, like a hidden form of protest in countries where sometimes protests in the street are not so common or allowed. Before we always had face-to-face sessions, and now since April we moved online. In the meantime, we had I show you just the link of the seminar in the case you are interested in follow our work. This is the link. And we have had these sessions in these years, and from April we started being online, so you can also watch the sessions on our webpage. We started with a session on the stay home without home, on housing rights and conflicts in COVID time. And after we already have had like this number of 6 sections on this format, so we are getting used to this. But we hopefully we come back to face-to-face sessions very soon. Oops, sorry, I want to, okay. So now I already talked too much. I want to introduce our guest of today. He doesn't need a large presentation because, as I said, many of you know his work very well. So he's one of the founders of social movement studies. He's a field to which he has been contributing in many different ways, very important for all of us. And I can say for myself in a very, very important way. Among his contribution to the field, there is, first of all, a development of the political process model, a dynamic model for the understanding of mobilization, which stresses the role of mobilizing structures, networks, framing processes, and at the same time, what also was very important, the role of subjectivities through a process of what he called cognitive liberation in engagement processes. In doing this, McAdam also contributed to open the debate in social movement studies to a more interactive, instead of unilateral, understanding of the relationship between social movements and the environment in which they act. And this model was particularly developed in his book, Political Process and the Development of the Black Insurgency, 1913-1917, published by the Chicago University Press. He was also pioneer for another field of study that was very precious to me. This is the analysis of the long-term biographical effects of engagement in social movements. And this study gave the origin to a book, many other results, articles, etc., and contributions, but particularly in a book, Freedom Summer, published by the Oxford University Press in 1990. He also co-author, among many other articles and books, of the co-author of Dynamic of Contention with Sidney Tarr and Charles Steele, in which again the aim is to strengthen a dynamic model for the understanding of social movements and in general conflictual situations, including revolutions, through a multi-level and multiple focus, including many different actors. Among his more recent book, we have with David Krasky, Rob Reich and Deborah Satz in 2012, the edited book Occupy the Future, and with Neil Flinkstein, Theory of Fields. And finally, I think is your last book, for what maybe you had published something else in the meantime, but I think that this is the last book you published, and is very connected to the topic of today's talk. Is a book published with Karina Klus in 2014 about deeply divided social movements and racial politics in post-war America. And this topic brings directly to our today presentation. To our today presentation and to the topic of today, that is, as you know, putting Trump in context, race, religion, and erosion of American democracy. So I give you the floor. Sorry if I have talked too much, but I think it was important to say something more about you. And in connection also to our seminar and our work here, Social Movement Scholars. So you have the floor, and after we can open to questions and comments. But for now, you can share your PowerPoint, and we are really happy to have you here. And thanks again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Guya. You did not talk too much. I liked what you said about the seminar. I got a sense of how dynamic it is, the speakers you've had. So I salute you guys for carrying on, even in very strange times, shall we say. I also want to thank everybody who's signed on, taking time out of crazy lives. We're living in very strange times, obviously. I hope everybody is well and safe. Things are crazy in the United States, as you know. I'm not going to talk exactly about that, but I certainly am going to focus on the United States in my remarks. I'm going to share my screen now, or share the slides. And I want to start with a quote that I just ran across. Uh-oh. Hang on. There we go. I want to share this quote that I ran across just last week. I was reading an article by Tim Parks in the New York Review of Books, and he wrote, Machiavelli would have been fascinated by Trump, but even more so by the social and political circumstances that allowed him to be successful. And that sort of quote really speaks to what I want to try to do in this talk. I've worried for a long time that Trump and what I don't know what to call it, his oversized presence, his extreme rhetoric and behavior has so riveted our attention on him over the last 4 years that we're in danger of losing critically important historical perspective. For all his uniqueness and unprecedented behavior and rhetoric, Trump is, in at least two senses, the product of prior influences and events in the US. And to me, it's important that we understand these older roots. Otherwise, we'll think that Trump is the source of the problem and that having removed him from office by this election, we will have somehow restored American democracy. Nothing could be further from the truth. In the talk, what I want to do is to try to put Trump in historical context in two different ways. The two ways reflect the two central aims of the book that Guya mentioned right at the end. It's the book I wrote with a former graduate student, Karina Klus, came out in 2014, so 2 years before Trump was really on the scene. The book was entitled Deeply Divided: Racial Politics and Social Movements in Post-War America. And in that book, Karina and I tried to do two things. First and most importantly, we sought to document and explain the critically important shift in what we called the racial geography of American politics that began in the 1960s and which over time has essentially transformed the two major parties and the entire political system in the United States. Most importantly, it turned the Republican Party, the party of Abraham Lincoln, from the more progressive party on race and civil rights into today's coalition of extreme racial conservatives. The point I'm trying to make is that for all of Trump's racist behavior and rhetoric, he is really more the logical, if extreme, expression or product of a brand of racially motivated exclusionary politics that have been practiced by the Republicans since the mid to late 1960s. So that's one sense in which I want to try to put Trump in context. The other is in the book with Karina, we sought to call attention to the serious threats to American democracy that had developed before Trump was elected, and which in fact greatly aided his rise to power. The last chapter of Deeply Divided laid out, described in detail, a host of fragile or flawed democratic institutions or practices, threats to democracy, again, that were in place before Trump, and which help explain how he came to be elected. I'm not sure how much time I'll have to talk about those, but I might just be able to list a few. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about them more. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the first half of the talk, again, I want to revisit the central argument we tried to make in Deeply Divided. For us, the focus was on the fundamental transformation, again, in what we called the racial geography of American politics. Began in the mid-1960s, but continues to powerfully shape life and politics in America today. To begin to understand the magnitude and importance of this shift, it's worth reminding ourselves how different the two major parties were in the US around 1960. And again, I need to change slides. So here are the two major parties roughly around 1960. Let me start with the Democrats. They were moderate centrist in ideological orientation around 1960. That is, the leading figures in the party were moderate centrists. The party was geographically centered in the southern United States, the so-called Solid South. Lots of ideological overlap with the Republicans. That is, there were many Republicans in Congress who were more liberal than their Democratic counterparts. And the party was absolutely schizophrenic on the issue of race or civil rights, simultaneously trying to accommodate the views of Southern segregationists on the one hand and liberal Northern labor Democrats on the other. As for the Republicans around 1960, they too were moderate centrist in ideological orientation. The party was centered in the Midwestern United States and the Northeast. Surprisingly, New York was a pretty reliable Republican state. Again, lots of ideological overlap with the Democrats, and generally more liberal. Not generally, they were definitely more liberal or progressive on matters of race and civil rights than the Democrats. Every time I'm teaching that to students now, they always interrupt and they say, I think you made a mistake there. It can't be possible that the Republicans are more liberal on race, but in fact they were. Let me present some evidence to support that. This is congressional voting on the 1957 Civil Rights Act. The bill was very, very weak. It had very little effect on civil rights, really. But symbolically, it was incredibly important because it marked the first time in about 80 years that Congress took up the issue of civil rights. And the bill passed because of overwhelming Republican support. You can see that 167 of 186 Republican House members voted for the bill and all 43 Republican senators. Now let's take a look at the party today, the two parties today. The Republican Party is extreme right in its orientation. We have not had a party that is this extreme either towards the right or the left in US history. Geographically centered in the Southern United States. Absolutely no ideological overlap with Democrats. That is, there is not a single Republican member of Congress who's more liberal in their voting record than the most conservative Democrat. And it is overwhelmingly a party of white racial conservatives. The Democrats in 2020, moderate left in orientation, geographically centered in the Northeast and Western United States, and highly diverse in racial and ethnic terms. So how did we get from where the two parties were in 1960 to where they are now? To begin to understand or to begin to answer the question, I need to set an even broader historical context. I want to talk about the Southern United States, the states of the former Confederacy from 1876 to 1960. And in fact, to do that, I have to push the story back even a little bit further, back to the end of the American Civil War. The war ended in 1865 with the radical anti-slavery Republicans firmly in control of the federal government. The next 11 years is a period in the US that we refer to as Reconstruction. This is the period in which the country is being reconstructed, brought back to a single entity, and the South is being rebuilt. And it's being rebuilt around a host of new economic, political, and social rights to African Americans. There's a lot of opposition to this, obviously, from white Southerners. And in response, the federal government sends troops to the South and stations troops there for this 11-year period. And yes, there's violence, yes, there's conflict, but the rights, new rights granted to African Americans hold reasonably well during this period, partly, of course, because of the presence of federal troops. But that all comes to an end in 1876. There's another presidential election where neither candidate, major candidate, receives sufficient electoral votes to gain the White House. And so the election is thrown into the House of Representatives to resolve. And it is resolved by the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, cutting a deal with Southern segregationists, Southern Democrats. He says, if you vote for me for president, I will withdraw federal troops and return control over racial matters to you. They do give him their votes. He follows through on his promise, withdraws federal troops, and over the next 10 years or so, all of the new rights granted to African Americans are abrogated or withdrawn or eliminated. They may remain on paper, but this is a brutal period in the history of the South. Again, a host of new laws are passed to create a new system of Jim Crow segregation backed by violence and terror. This is when lynching becomes very, very common. We're averaging over 100 lynchings a year. It is a brutal period, and it holds really from 1876 substantially all the way to 1960. During that period, essentially the South is a one-party racial autocracy. Republicans are hated. Republican parties have been driven out of the region. It is a one-party state or set of states organized around sort of restrictive race relations. Democrats are firmly in control, and because they're the only party in the South, they are the most loyal component, if you will, or partner of the National Democratic Party electoral coalition. They essentially dominate the party, and their views on civil rights basically become the views of the party as a whole. So that's what's going on in the South. Now the fun part is to look at some electoral maps to see how just how solid the South is in terms of its support for the Democratic Party. This is the election of 1928. The Republican Herbert Hoover is elected president. You can see he wins very comfortably, except for the dissent of the solid Democratic South, which will never, they vow, never vote Republican. In 1929, the stock market crashes, ushering in the Great Depression. By the next election, 1932, voters all over the country are blaming Republicans and Hoover for the Depression. Here's the result. This is Franklin Roosevelt's first term as president. He wins in what at that time was the biggest landslide in American presidential history, but he wins by an even larger margin 4 years later, 1936. There's virtually no virtually no Republicans in the House or Senate, giving Roosevelt this extraordinary legislative majority, and he's able to push through lots and lots of New Deal legislation. He runs for an unprecedented third term in 1940 and wins again comfortably. There's a little bit of pushback, but again, he wins very, very comfortably, as he does in 1944. When he wins a fourth term as president. I'm going to skip the election of 1948. That's an interesting but complicated one, and jump to 1952. This is the only time in this roughly 40-year span where the Republicans win the White House. This is Dwight Eisenhower, the celebrated war hero from World War II. He wins comfortably, but again, you see that the South remains solidly Democratic. Same thing happens in 1956. You see the map looking very, very similar, all red except for the solid Democratic South. And the last map I'm going to show you, well, at least for a minute, is 1960. This is a much closer election. This is John F. Kennedy running against Richard Nixon in 1960. Kennedy wins a very narrow victory, and no region is more important to his victory than the South, especially the 24 electoral votes of Texas, which is why Kennedy picked Lyndon Johnson, senator from Texas, to be his running mate as vice president, even though they couldn't stand each other. He wins very, very narrowly. And so we've now looked at a long period really of American history from, I would say, the end of the Civil War to 1960, a period characterized by remarkable stability in the underlying regional and racial structure of American politics. But this is all about to change quickly, and with significant upstream consequences for life and politics in the US, consequences we're still dealing with today. The change is going to come about, this transformation in the racial geography of American politics is going to come about as a result of two parallel or linked social movements: the African American civil rights movement on the one hand, and the white resistance movement to the civil rights struggle. You might say, well, Guy, was that really a movement? It was absolutely a movement. It's remained a movement ever since. It's not organized at the national level exactly, but there are lots of organizations. There were lots of organizations in the 1960s or 50s even, absolutely dedicated to resisting any move towards civil rights reform. These are two movements that explode in American life in the 1950s and especially the 1960s. Let me start with the civil rights movement. This is a graph of the annual civil rights movement actions from 1948 to 1976. This graph comes from my dissertation. The data for the graph came from coding every last page of every last issue of the New York Times from 1948 to 1976. But I don't put the graph up to elicit sympathy for all the work I had to do on my dissertation. I put it up simply to indicate just what a force the civil rights movement was for a long period of time in the 50s and especially the 1960s. We always think of the civil rights movement, the mass movement phase of the movement, as beginning in Montgomery, Alabama, with the bus boycott that catapulted Martin Luther King to fame. That's this little blip, this little peak centered around 1956. After the bus boycott was over, nothing much happened for the remainder of the period, the late 1950s. Partly because the Southern state legislatures were obsessed with stopping the civil rights movement and passed lots of restrictive legislation that outlawed civil rights organizations and made it that much harder for people to organize. The much bigger peak in 1960 are the lunch counter sit-ins that occurred in 1960. It's the sit-in movement that really revitalizes the civil rights movement and ushers in this extraordinary sustained period of mobilization by civil rights forces. We've never really seen another movement that exercised this level of mobilization over, say, a 10-year period, I think, in the history of the United States. The other thing that's worth noting here is that this period that we're looking at, say 1960 to 68, 70, something like that, is also the hottest years of the Cold War. Why is that important? It's important because the American-style racism is a huge foreign policy liability during this period. Here, the US is locked into this intense ideological struggle with the Soviet Union for influence with nations around the globe. And again, American-style racism really undercuts America's claims to be this beacon of democracy. So this is a period where the pressures of the Cold War combine with the pressures of the civil rights movement to put enormous pressure on the American state to put its racial house in order. And under the twin pressures of the Cold War and the civil rights movement, the Democrats, who are in control of the federal government and they are in the White House, they begin to move sharply left. First under Kennedy, I would say more cautiously under Kennedy, and then much more aggressively and creatively under Lyndon Johnson. All of the significant civil rights legislation that we associate with this period comes from those two administrations, Johnson in particular. And even as we celebrate those legislative achievements, we have to acknowledge that they came at enormous political cost to the Democrats and Johnson in particular. So here's a slide. The 1960s sit-ins revitalized the civil rights struggle, ushering in the heyday of the movement and putting the northern and southern wings of the Democratic Party on a collision course. Johnson's aggressive advocacy of civil rights costs him the Deep South in 1964. Here's the electoral map. Again, Johnson's enormously popular. He wins handily, except for the descent of the Republican South. This is something unthinkable has happened, that the solid Democratic South for the first time in history has gotten over its hatred of the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, and voted Republican. I want to, again, this is nothing less than a kind of political world turned upside down from the structure that existed beforehand. And to show that, I just want to bounce back and forth between this electoral map and one I showed you earlier, that the 1956 map of Eisenhower's second victory. Oops. You can see, I mean, essentially, it's the mirror image of the previous, of the 1956 electoral map. So that's what's happening with the Democrats under the pressure of the civil rights movement. But let me now talk about the other movement that I mentioned, the white resistance movement, and its effect on the Republican Party. As Democrats are moving left under the pressure of the civil rights movement and the Cold War, the Republicans are moving just as sharply to the right under the, to court basically, or to take advantage of the opportunity afforded them by the white, or the resistance, the Southern resistance, or the resistance movement, the white resistance movement to the civil rights struggle. The Republicans have been out of power really since Roosevelt took office in 1932, but the white resistance movement, which is maybe centered in the South, but literally is strong all over the country, affords Republicans the opportunity to court Southern segregationists and racial conservatives all over the country, and to rebuild the party or rebrand the party around a new brand of exclusionary racial politics. And that's what the Republicans do. At the presidential level, the breakthrough comes in 1968. Nixon runs on what he calls his Southern strategy, which really means he's going to court white Southerners who are angry over what the Democrats are doing in terms of civil rights reform. Nixon splits 86% of the popular vote with the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey. George Wallace, the arch segregationist governor of Alabama, runs a very strong third-party challenge and captures the remaining 14% of the vote. Here's the map from that year. Again, the whole of the South either goes Republican or votes or for George Wallace. Those are the yellow or gold states you see there. But this again further moves the Republicans that much further to the right on the issue of race or civil rights. You can see that not only is the regional structure of American politics shifting, so is the racial structure. Here is, we're looking at the share of the Black vote that goes Republican and Democrat from 1956 to 1968. In 1956, 40% of the Black vote remains Republican, 60% Democratic. In 1960, when Nixon runs the first time, he still gets a quarter of the Black vote. By 1968, that share of the Black vote is 3%. African Americans understand that the parties are moving in entirely different directions. And the African Americans moved from being once very loyal Republicans to the most loyal of Democrats as the Republican Party is moving in to the right in a very dramatic way on matters of race and civil rights. One other important note about that 1968 presidential election, Nixon is the first Republican politician to invoke, powerfully invoke this image of two Americas. In his standard campaign speech from that year, he would say something like, he would say that the New Deal under Roosevelt was generally a good thing because the few were asked to give for the benefit of the deserving many. And then he would criticize the Democrats under Kennedy and Johnson for asking the many to give for the benefit of the undeserving few. And in the coded racial language of that time, everybody understood that Nixon was talking about African Americans. He was appealing to white racial conservatives and Southern segregationists, and it worked. But if he was the first Republican to invoke that image of two Americas and of deserving, overwhelmingly white Americans and undeserving voters of color, every Republican since Nixon has picked up on that rhetorical framing. Let me give you an example. Mitt Romney, very polished candidate. Here's Mitt Romney in 2012, and I won't read the whole quote, but there are 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what, who are dependent upon government, who believe that they are victims, who believe the government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they are entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. At the bottom, Obama wants to transform America into an entitlement society. So here again, there are there's these deserving, hardworking, and by the way, mostly white Americans who are being taxed heavily for the benefit of these undeserving, lazy Americans. Romney lost in 2012. And many Republican strategists in the wake of that defeat said, look, we can't keep painting ourselves into this demographic corner and appeal only to whites. We need to broaden our appeal to African Americans and especially Hispanic voters. Most of the major Republican presidential candidates in 2016 got that memo. Needless to say, Donald Trump didn't. He doubled down and offered really the most extreme racist version of the same two Americas message. And he made it work. And he has deepened the racial divide in this country incalculably. It is in this sense that Trump is just the most extreme expression of a brand of exclusionary racial politics that's been embraced by the Republican Party since at least the late 1960s. So again, I've tried in the first part of the talk to situate Trump in terms of the Republican Party's longer history of racially motivated exclusionary politics. I'm now going to bring the talk to a close by trying to at least take a few minutes and put him into a second historical context. And this concerns the erosion of democratic institutions and norms that started well before Trump took office. You know, people rightly fear the impact of the Trump presidency on the health and well-being of American democracy. But I fear something else too, and that is we will define Trump as the origin of these anti-democratic trends and fail to recognize the many threats to democracy that preceded Trump and indeed greatly aided his rise to power. The last chapter, Deeply Divided, was devoted to a detailed description and discussion of a host of serious threats to American democracy that were already in place. Again, I don't want to take any more time to talk about these in any great detail, but let me at least list a few. So well before Trump took office, the Republican legislatures in lots of states across the country began to enact much more restrictive voting laws. And they were very clear on what these laws were supposed to do. In fact, I wasn't going to do this, but let me go forward. Look at the second quote here. This is a Republican official in North Carolina talking about the new ID cards that they were going to require for voting. The new ID cards are a way to reduce voting by a bunch of lazy blacks that wants the government to give them everything. And there were many other sort of admissions like that. But the Republican legislatures passed any number of more restrictive voting laws designed to make it harder for Democratic constituents to vote. Young people, voters of color, immigrants. Second important threat to democracy, an epidemic of extreme gerrymandering. You may not know what that term refers to. It's the redrawing of district boundaries, House district boundaries, with the intent of creating a safe district for your party. And the Republicans have engaged in this with great enthusiasm since around 2000. It's dramatically increased the number of safe Republican seats. And this is one of the bad things about the last election, the 2020 election just a few weeks ago, is that the Republicans did much better than the Democrats at the state level and now control more state houses. So you can expect more gerrymandering in the years to come as those state Republican legislatures redraw that many more House boundaries. Essentially, the Republicans eliminated any meaningful campaign finance reforms or restrictions, which has allowed a flood of elite money into American politics. And the last one, which I think is really important, but it's hard to describe precisely, but involves the way we nominate presidential candidates. It's the system of primaries and caucuses that really favor extreme candidates like Trump. It's this system that really allowed Trump to become the nominee of the Republican Party. The establishment Republicans didn't want Trump at all, but the way we select presidential candidates so empowers the radical movement wings of the two parties that you're likely to continue to see very extreme right candidates come through and become the nominees of the Republican Party. I'm going to stop there. I thank you for your patience, and we can open it up to Q&A.
Wow, thank you so much. I was ready to listen to you much more because you were so like so interesting and I was really thrilled by your talk. But now I think it will be very important to open the floor. For sure, we have many questions. Yeah, we can collect the question from the chat as. And if someone wants to talk or want to put a question or to say something or make a comment, yes, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit confused maybe, but because I already received many demands from the public. Okay, so first, Liran, you can you can ask your question. And after is Mario Diani, and after I think there is Christina that also wanted to. So we have this order for now: Liran, Mario, Christina, and after. Sorry for my pronunciation of your name, Zach. Is it right?
Yes.
Okay, so we can start with Liran. You can ask the question.
Yes, thank you. That was a very interesting talk and illuminating for those of us less familiar with American electoral history. I just have a very specific question. I didn't quite understand why is it that the Democrats decided in the 60s to suddenly change tack? Is it purely a Cold War calculation thing, which then implies that it was just a question of timing? Had the Republicans been the ones in power in the 60s during the beginning of, during the African-American social movement rise, they might have also made that sort of calculus that it's good for foreign relations for America's standing, and thereby have reversed all of history?
Yes, I think yours is a great question, and very, I think, very savvy understanding. Yes, I think the principal reason that the civil rights movement developed when it did and was as successful as it was because it was happening in the Cold War context. To me, I mean, every Cold War president acted to promote civil rights reform. To me, the really interesting contrast is between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his successor, Harry Truman. Roosevelt was arguably the most popular president in American history. He was not very electorally vulnerable. He won by huge margins. He could have embraced the need for civil rights reform, but he said nothing about civil rights during his 4 terms in office. He was also governing during arguably the most progressive period in American history, the 30s, and he had lots of advisors who were pushing him to say something about civil rights, and he refused. Harry Truman takes over when Roosevelt dies in office. Harry Truman is not very popular. He's facing a real challenge to get elected himself in 1948. And he's governing not during the progressive 30s, but the much more conservative Cold War 40s, late 40s. And yet he comes out for civil rights reform. He issues a host of executive orders. He appoints a really high-profile national commission to investigate racial disparities and to recommend reforms. And he's doing this because he's governing during the Cold War. He's under the same kind of Cold War pressure that Eisenhower's going to be under, that Kennedy's going to be under, that Johnson's going to be under. The civil rights movement really isn't active yet, and yet Truman is already embracing the need for civil rights reform. And everybody's saying, you're risking losing the election in 1948 because you're going to piss off the southern wing of the party. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. I said when I was going through the electoral maps, we weren't going to look at 1948. The reason is because it's so unusual. The Democrats run their own third-party candidate against Truman, and the electoral votes of 4 southern states go to this third-party candidate. That's how angry the Southern Democrats are. When Eisenhower takes over, he behaves just the same way Truman did. He issues executive orders. He offers up a civil rights bill. He sends troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, when there's riots around the desegregation of the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. And then Kennedy behaves the same way, and then Johnson behaves the same way. The pressure of the Cold War shaped the context in which the civil rights movement became that much more effective. And your last point, I think, is really interesting. Nixon lost just by a very small margin. If Nixon had won instead of Kennedy, I don't doubt that he would have moved in the same direction that Kennedy and later Johnson did. That is, under the pressure of the civil rights movement, I think there would have been civil rights bills and they would have been passed, but the anger of the white South would have been directed at the Republican Party, which they couldn't stand anyway. So it probably would have left the regional structure of American politics the same, at least for some extended period of time. It's a great question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Miriam, for your question. So now we have Mario Gianni.
Hi.
To ask a question.
First of all, congratulations for dropping the word counter movement to describe instances of collective action that we do not like. I think it's a very important.
It is.
It's a very useful argument, recognizing the fact that there is also forms of coordination and organizing which have their own distinctiveness and not just in opposition to other phenomena. That's a good starting point. But my question, primary question is, okay, well, how much matter on top of the racial issue? There has also been an intensification of conflicts around moral and personal issues linked to personal behavior, sexual minorities, etc., which have also brought altered the geography of the states in complex way. If you look at the electoral map, even recently, you really see the West and the Northeast and the entire the area in between, which is really very much into conservative Republican, current Republican version. And so I was wondering how much it mattered on the fact that was the very success of not only of the civil rights movement, also the other movements. They played a very important role in diversifying the constituency, because the impression until the 60s, the 70s, American politics were described, for example, by Giovanni Sartori as dominated by pragmatism, and that was very well. But the picture you showed looked pretty much seemed to suggest a swing of the electorate in a fairly consistent way, depending on opinion. They reflected the representation of the electorate swinging depending on the opinion, but that was possible because it was extremely homogeneous electorate that excluded not only the blacks, but also to some extent other types of, let's say, less central, less mainstream groups. So I wonder, really, what what's the role of this, of the success of the civil rights movements in generating the conditions which have brought to this extreme right development in the Republican Party, combined also, I suspect, with the role of religion, which you haven't touched so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I just have to say it's great to see Mario. Mario's an old friend and I miss him. We can't travel these days. I hadn't seen Mario in the flesh for quite some time. In any case, it's a great question. I think race is arguably the most important influence in the story I'm telling, but you're quite right. The 60s didn't just bring us the civil rights movement, it brought us a host of other movements that made cultural politics a really salient part of sort of the American divide between Republicans and Democrats. And so when Republicans over the last 50 years, including Romney, including Trump, talk about undeserving Americans, they don't simply mean racial minorities. They also mean LBGT, they mean illegal immigrants, they mean those who seek abortions. So a host of cultural issues have sort of reinforced this two Americas image. So race helps for the Republicans to demarcate that undeserving America. But there's also other cultural factors that play into this resentment of white conservatives toward a host of others that have been vilified by Trump and other Republicans.
Mm-hmm. That's okay. So, see, satisfied with. I think that Christina had a question. Christina Flesher.
Thanks, Guya, and thanks, Doug, very much. I actually have a very technical question, so you might hate me for asking this, but I'm really fascinated to know more about the way that the primaries and caucuses, you're saying that how those presidential candidates are selected has really led to favoring extreme candidates. And if you could just say a little bit more about that, because that really piqued my curiosity.
Yeah, I'd love to. This to me is one of the most important and little known stories in sort of recent American history that has had huge impacts on who the nominees wind up being, presidential nominees wind up being in both parties. And I'll try to tell this story as quickly as I can, but it's a complicated story. In 1968, again, Nixon ran against Hubert Humphrey. Those are the two major candidates. But the story of how Humphrey came to be the nominee of the Democratic Party is fascinating. I don't expect most of you to have any sense of this, but 1968, this is when I began to be politically active. So I was totally attuned to the events of that year. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago that year was the most violent convention that we've ever had in American history. There were pitched battles between the police and protesters in the streets. And when people think about that year and someone says, well, why was there so much violence in the streets? Everybody says, well, it was the war in Vietnam. The Democratic Party was blamed for the war. And so the protesters in the street were protesting against the war. That's not strictly true. Indirectly, yes, but they were protesting what was going on the convention floor. So here's the broader story. Johnson withdrew from the race. He could have run, but he withdrew early in the race, leaving only really one candidate, Eugene McCarthy, who was an outspoken anti-war senator, Democratic senator. And he was running sort of unopposed for 2 or 3 primaries. And then Bobby Kennedy threw himself into the race, and McCarthy and Kennedy sort of traded primary victories until this really important California primary with all its votes. And Kennedy won that primary, and then of course was shot and killed as he was leaving a hotel where his victory party was going on. That left McCarthy as the only candidate. McCarthy finished out the primaries, and then we were headed to the convention. So of course, McCarthy's going to be the nominee, right? No, not at all. Because the rules, the primaries that happened that year, there weren't very many of them. There were like 15, and they were not binding on the party. So you ran these primaries, but the party was not obliged to honor the results of the primary. And so Humphrey, who hadn't even competed in a primary, the party bosses in Chicago went, yeah, we don't want McCarthy, we want Humphrey. So there was nothing democratic about this process at all. And that's how it had always been. The party could do whatever it wanted at the convention, even if there were primaries leading up to it. Right. Well, that year in 1968, because of what was going on, anti-war activists that I knew well went to the convention with the intent of forcing the Rules Committee to to basically make McCarthy the nominee. Well, they failed in that, but they did get the committee to hold a voice vote on the last night of the convention. Nobody really knew what they were voting on, but essentially what they were voting on is whether or not the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party, should create a commission to investigate the means by which nominees were picked and to propose democratic remedies, more democratic methods. The voice vote passed, the same group of anti-war activists who had brought this to the convention immediately constituted themselves as the commission that had just been appointed. They got George McGovern, a very strong anti-war senator, to chair it. And over the next 2-3 years, they rewrote the rules by which we nominate presidents or presidential candidates. And it obliged every single state to have a democratic means for electing delegates. And those delegates, when they went to the convention, were going to be bound by the popular vote in the state. You follow?
Yep.
So this is way more democratic than what the system that existed beforehand. But it's ironically now starting to produce lots of non-democratic outcomes, because essentially these primaries, and especially the caucuses, are low turnout events, and they're the perfect vehicle for
opportunistic,
increasing the influence of the movement wing of the party. You could see in 2016, this is what we predicted in Deeply Divided, that the Republicans already knew this game, and you could expect to get an extreme right candidate in 2016. The party didn't want Trump. It was very clear at the beginning of the process, but the primaries and caucuses at the state level were the perfect vehicle for Trump activists. So he won easily. So we've got a system in place that basically magnifies the voice of the extreme movement wings of the two parties and really mutes the voice of the moderate centrist voters.
But can I just have a quick follow-up, Guya? It's just the one thing that confuses me about that. Well, two things. One thing is that it seems like if you oblige there to be a certain level of participation, you could introduce a corrective to that pretty easily, couldn't you? If you just said that the caucuses have to be, or the primaries have to have a certain level of voter turnout before they're valid or they're taken into consideration. But that's just one thought that occurs to me. But the other question I had related to that is that how do you explain then that the Democratic Party keeps choosing these really establishment figures despite mass movements of support for, say, people like Bernie Sanders or even for Elizabeth Warren, and then we just end up with the most establishment, most sort of conservative possible Democrat being the Democratic candidate? So how does your theory play out in that? Like, what's at work there? Because we would expect then to have more progressive or more extreme or whatever you want to call them candidates, but we ended up getting these real establishment figures.
Yeah, two great questions, both great questions. Let me address the first one. I don't know exactly what you could possibly do to insist that the level of participation reaches a certain ceiling. It has to be 20%. It's typically, primaries are 12 to 15%. Caucuses are 0.5%. And caucuses are increasing because they're much cheaper to run, so the states like them. And frankly, on the Republican side, the party is a movement. They want this to happen. They don't want to restrict the voice of the movement wing of the party. As to your second question, really interesting, the Democrats were the first who really sort of saw movement candidates come through this process. George McGovern was the first of those. He was really a movement candidate. The establishment didn't like him. And he was the nominee in '72 under these new rules. And the party establishment didn't like it. And they started futzing with the system to make it harder for movement candidates to come through. At some point, and I don't remember when exactly this started, but they created so-called super delegates.
Right.
I don't know if you've heard of this.
Yeah.
But the super delegates were picked by the National Democratic Committee, and they were establishment Democrats. So Hillary Clinton in 2000, 16 got all of the virtually all of the superdelegates. And that was her margin against Bernie Sanders.
Right.
If there hadn't been superdelegates, it would have been much closer. And by the way, Bernie Sanders won every single caucus because it's the lower turnout, it's the lowest turnout, lowest turnout kind of election. So you're asking all the right questions. And frankly, I think the parties need to have more of a conversation about, is this really what we want to do? But nobody seems to understand that it's had this effect. Now, you know, most of us on the call have some commitment to the idea that movements are good. Well, movements are powerful, but they may deliver, you know, non-progressive, illiberal kinds of outcomes. And we at least need to be aware of the way that our institutions, our political institutions, either increase or mute the voice of movements.
Yep. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Great questions.
Thank you very much for your question, Christina, and for your answers, Doug. So now we have a more question from Bazak. After Arseni and Lawrence, I hope that this is the right order. Some of you asked to ask questions on the chat order with the hand, but okay, we can move to Bazak.
Actually, Christina asked my question. My question was also about why turnout in primaries and caucuses doesn't explain why, like, we had a more, you know, conservative candidate and not Bernie Sanders elected. So we can just move on. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. If you have other questions, you can ask now, or okay, we can move on. And after. So we have Arseni that asked for a question. Are you there?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Doug, for your talk. I have a question about the Cold War context. I know that the Soviet Union courted some social movements. For example, there is hardly anyone from my parents' generation who didn't write letters in support of Angela Davis when she was arrested. But I'm curious whether the civil rights movements themselves used the Soviet Union as a leverage in their struggle, and what they thought of the Soviet Union in this respect.
Yes. I mean, I don't think the civil rights movement were fans of the Soviet Union, but they absolutely understood the leverage that the Cold War gave the civil rights movement, and they exploited it. I mean, one of the real strategic, I think the brilliant sort of strategies used by civil rights forces was you would essentially court white racist violence. You would have mass demonstrations. You'd put people in the streets. And you actually were hoping that the segregationists would overreact with violence, because when they did, this was front page news, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And the Soviet Union would immediately, use these outbreaks of violence in the United States to discredit the United States and mock American democracy. And President Kennedy in particular worked really hard backstage to try to convince civil rights leaders not to engage in nonviolent direct action, but to engage in more institutional forms of action, because he knew that if they continued to court violence and you had these periodic explosions of violence, that it would be front page news, and it would play into the propaganda hands of the Soviet Union, and put that much more pressure on Kennedy to embrace the need for civil rights reform. Kennedy, remember, won by a very narrow margin. He wanted to try to keep the Southern wing of the party loyal to him. So he knew that anytime he embraced the need for civil rights reform, he was undermining his chances of winning re-election in 1964. So the basic answer to your question is the civil rights leaders absolutely understood the value of operating in this Cold War context, even if they didn't have any particular ideological commitment to the Soviet system. Great question.
Thank you, Doc, for your answer. And so now Lawrence Davis also wanted to ask for comments.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk, particularly the really interesting information about the civil rights era and the impact that the civil rights era struggles had on American politics. I have two questions, if I may. The first question is about socioeconomic issues. So it seems to me that in the American press in particular, but in the global press as well, that there are sort of two different narratives about the most recent election and indeed the last election, 2016, which were emphasized. The first was the racial shifts, which you devote most of your talk to, but the other was socioeconomic issues, particularly in the Rust Belt in the United States, the rural-urban divide. On the left, the Bernie Sanders campaign in both elections strongly emphasized issues to do with socioeconomic class and class struggle. So I'm just wondering, since you didn't spend a lot of time talking about that, how you think those issues play out or map onto the issues you did discuss to do with race and the erosion of democratic institutions and norms. And then my second question is, interesting, another word that didn't come up in your talk is populism. And yet, this was a dominant theme in the media, again, American media, the global media, but also in the Trump campaigns, the constant bashing of elites, Clinton in particular, Secretary Clinton, but the promise to drain the swamp in Washington. And this seems to have really resonated in the population. So I'm wondering if, when you talk about the erosion of American democratic institutions and norms, we can think of that erosion in a broader sense, not just in terms of gerrymandering, restrictive voting laws, et cetera, these institutional forms, but also a broader erosion in terms of the gap, if you will, between democratic ideals and the reality of the hollowing out of popular sovereignty in the United States over quite a long period of time.
Yeah, those are, again, just phenomenal questions. Yeah, I think, let me answer the second one first. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's easier to talk about, to point to very specific flawed institutions, but I think there is a broader sense in which sort of American democratic ideals, norms, values have been eroded or hollowed out over a long period of time. And that, I don't see that changing anytime soon, given the divisions in the US. Let me go, I guess, to the first question, also a really, really good question. I think I would say something similar to what I said to Mario in answer to his question. Yeah, as central as race is, it isn't the only factor. Obviously economic issues have been terribly salient in helping to reinforce these divisions as well. Again, though, I don't think these are separate. That is, the Republicans have used race for 50 plus years to discredit or to criticize a host of undeserving Americans, and to sort of essentially say to white conservatives, you're hardworking, you're the one whose hard-earned tax dollars are being used to support these others. And by the way, these others are overwhelmingly voters of color or other undeserving groups in the US. So the anti-tax thing, which has dramatically enhanced income inequality and wealth inequality in the US, right? You just cannot propose new taxes, is rooted in this, well, those new taxes are going to be paid by these hardworking, overwhelmingly white Americans, and those monies are going to go for all these dependent, undeserving Americans who, oh, by the way, are disproportionately voters of color. You follow? So yes, economic issues are central to the dynamics we're talking about, but they're not independent of racially inflected appeals around issues of taxes and who's going to be paying and so forth. So I don't see them operating independently. The Republicans, under the guise of protecting hardworking white Americans, have been able to reduce taxes on the very rich and promote income inequality and wealth inequality, which in fact has wound up hurting a significant majority of Trump supporters, for instance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for the question, and Doug for your answer. So I think that Tiago also had a question. Tiago?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I have two questions, but
just to introduce you, Tiago Carvalho is a colleague here at ISCTE. He's organizing with me this seminar and in general the seminar series. Sorry to interrupt you.
No worries. No, and I wanted to thank you also for accepting our invitation to be here today to give such an interesting talk. Well, I have sort of two interrelated questions that has to do basically with this idea of, that you said, the white resistance movement or white supremacy. One has to do, what is the role of evangelics in this, in this message, in terms of organization, in terms of social basis, to the building up of this idea of, or this type of candidates, if you want, in Trump. Because you talk about religion, your title, but you didn't speak much about that. The other one is related with this, but it's, the other day I was reading a media article, newspaper article that said, well, that basically the Republicans are following this strategy that more and more restricts or limits the kind of constituencies that from where they get their vote from. So I was thinking, well, are the Republicans going to go also from the kind of movement that the Democrats went in the 60s, or are they going to keep doing these measures that erode democracy, as you were saying by the end of your talk? And that's it. Thank you.
I'm not totally sure I understand the second question, but I'll come back to that one and
sure.
you can clarify. But the first one on religion, another really interesting question. By the way, my title doesn't have the word religion in it, it's region. So I was talking about region, but the religion piece of this is very interesting. In point of fact, evangelicals were not very involved in politics before the 1970s. There was, in fact, this general sense that, we're about saving souls and salvation, and we don't want to get involved in this amoral realm of politics. So evangelicals were not a force in American politics prior to the 1970s. They got involved in the 1970s for two reasons. One was because, and it gets back to Mario's question about kind of cultural issues. There were evangelical leaders who were very concerned that kind of the 60s, all the immorality of the 60s, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll were polluting American society, and evangelicals could no longer stay on the sidelines. They had to get involved. So that was one influence. The other influence was Jimmy Carter, who was a born-again Christian and evangelical. And the first real mobilization of evangelicals was in support of Carter's 1976 campaign, and he won. And then 4 years later, the evangelicals in general were appalled by Jimmy Carter's policies. They thought, oh my God, we've been fooled by one of our own. And they all attached themselves to Ronald Reagan, or at least substantially to Ronald Reagan. And they've been a powerful force in Republican politics ever since. And so again, here's another constituency that's more focused, less focused on race and more focused on cultural issues that have signed on to the Republican coalition. So that's really, as I see it, the story of the evangelicals. But second question, I still wasn't quite sure.
So the idea was that in this newspaper article was that somehow the Republicans more and more were attached to this particular constituency, white, you know, but so they were losing with more and more diversity in the states. That, you know, probably if they keep attaching themselves just to that constituency, they wouldn't have much of a future, but rather they would have to go for what you were saying by the end of the talk, that was like changing laws and gerrymandering and so on. So where do you see the Republican Party go in that sense?
Oh my God, what a great question, what a crucial question. You know, again, after Romney lost, there was a real sense in Republican strategy amongst Republican strategists and campaign officials that, okay, we painted ourselves into this corner demographically. The white percent of the electorate is shrinking every year. We're going to have to broaden the appeal. And Trump obviously went in the other direction and made it work. And he still drew 73 million votes, you know, after a really, what from my point of view is a disastrous 4-year presidency. And the problem for the Republicans is that the party, the base, is Trump supporters. So if you start to broaden, if you seek to broaden your appeal, you're likely to anger the base. I think that's the dilemma they're in. That's why they tend to still be quiet in the face, that, you know, they don't really speak out at any point because they fear they're going to anger the base of the Republican Party. So given that they're in that situation, what I think they're going to continue to do is to try to devise ways to restrict access to the ballot for Democratic constituencies. They'll do everything they can to magnify the value of white votes and while diminishing black votes. I mean, again, they are going to be in a great position to remake all the House boundaries, the district boundaries in 2/3, no more, 70% of the states in the United States. And the goal has been really clear. They're willing to draw one huge kind of urban district and just say that's going to be a Democratic district. And meanwhile, we're going to create many, many smaller, safe Republican districts. And they've been able to make that work. So I suspect they're going to continue to move in that direction. I just don't see what other strategic choice they have in the short run. I think long term, it's a losing strategy, but everybody understood it was a losing strategy in 2012, and we're now, the Republicans are even more to the right than they were then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot. So maybe we don't have a more question. I take advantage of my position to ask something too. So I know that we discussed it before in our emails sharing. about this topic, and I know that you, Doug, are not directly investigating this moment, this topic of recent social movements in the United States, like Black Lives Matters or the Women March, and there was this kind of quite strong mobilizations ongoing in the last years. But I would really interested to hear a little bit your reflections. If you have some reflections, some feedback to give to us about these dynamics and the impact on the processes you were describing. And of course, we all know that it's very difficult to detect and understand the causes and consequences and the outcomes of social movements. Is a very complicated topic. We all know this, but I don't know. We can also see that we in the American Congress now there is an increase in pluralization and diversification of the political and also ethnic identities. So in which way we can look at this, as a result of these dynamics and counter dynamics that you were describing, and how we can look at this process and what it can bring to this discussion. I don't know if it was clear, this question.
It is. I think, the level of mobilization among progressives is the highest it's ever been in my lifetime. My daughters say, well, what about the 1960s? I said, look, the 1960s, there was also a substantial amount of new left mobilization spread across a lot of movements, but nothing like we've seen since 2016. And especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder this past spring. The numbers of people who took to the streets, the diversity of those who took to the streets, the fact that this was all over the United States in rural areas was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
The level of mobilization by millennials is like nothing we've seen.
Yeah.
And I think without that level of movement mobilization, there's no way Joe Biden wins. I know lots of progressives were not thrilled with Biden as the candidate relative to some of the others in the field, but progressives in general said, okay, well, I may not like him, but we've got to get rid of Trump. Again, I actually think the protests after George Floyd's death were key to Biden's win. If George Floyd isn't murdered, or that video doesn't go viral, and there isn't that level of mobilization in the streets, I think turnout in the election would have been sufficiently lower that Trump would have won. So I think the movements were absolutely critical. To me, the big question going forward for progressives is, the progressives in resisting Trump and opposing Trump, you got a lot of pragmatic coalition politics by progressives, which is not something we've seen in the States since the late 60s, early 70s. The civil rights movement and other early new left movements were nothing if not pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
They were into coalition politics. It was a coalition across class, race, gender lines. But the left splintered in the United States in the late 60s, early 70s, and it struggled to reconstitute itself as a more pragmatic coalition of progressives. It has functioned that way over the last 4 years. But we all know this story. You look at non-democracies and you look at popular movements that drive Milosevic from office, or Ferdinand Marcos, or some other dictator. But all the progressives agree upon is that they want this guy out. And then once he or she is out, then we have to look and see what happens to the progressive coalition and whether it begins to splinter again. For the US, for progressives to have any chance to start to rebuild and revitalize American democracy, this pragmatic coalition of progressive forces is going to have to stay strong. And I worry about that. I worry whether that will be possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. So Mario, Diani also asked you to...
Exactly on this point. I think that the $1 million is, to what extent, I'm simplifying it, is identity politics an obstacle to the kind of goal you have? It reminds me, back in the day, 1992, you had this piece with Deb Friedman, where you made this simple point. The stronger your message is, the more motivated, but the smaller your potential constituencies is, the softer it is, the more you reach out into other. Have you forgotten about that? No, you haven't.
Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, anyway, but the thing is, yeah, exactly. The bottom line is taking out the presence of a big enemy, exactly, as you were saying, like Trump. To what extent can you achieve, if you don't, a kind of unity, if you don't move away the focus from the identity to more material economic issue? But by definition, identity policy means that it is very difficult to negotiate. Of course, it can be interpreted in different ways, but ultimately, if the focus of your activism is what you are, the way you define yourself, it becomes much more difficult to negotiate, it seems to me.
I just think that's brilliant. That's right on target. That's my worry. Is the right in the U.S. is, in identity terms, and in ethnic and racial terms, much more homogeneous, and the left is very, very diverse in racial ethnic gender, sexual orientation, religion, etc. And the left has come together in the most powerful, most sustained way that we've seen since the 1960s. And I think it's had huge effects. And from my political point of view, very positive effects. But with Trump hopefully out and becoming less relevant, we might see the kinds of splintering along various lines of identity that have really hampered mobilization on the left for the last 50 years, really. That is a worry. Ironically, part of me wants Trump not to go away, but to continue to be a real force in American politics, helping to hold the pragmatic progressive coalition together in opposition to the kind of ugly vision of America that Trump continues to promote.
Yeah, sure. I was thinking that there is an issue that has always fascinated me, also in the bad sense, about this identitarian politics, particularly in the United States, but also in other countries, and is the idea of nativism that push it to the extreme. The only native are American Indians, so is a kind of counterintuitive from someone maybe that is not from the United States to understand the use of this message and this argument by the American right, because of course it can be pushed to other directions and also polarize in other directions the political discourse and also the political field, also against the very origin of the meaning for right wing. I don't know, it's very strange for me from outside, let's say, the discourse about nativism.
Yeah. Very well said. Great point.
Maybe Christina also has another question. I think she asked us to talk. Yeah.
Thanks. Doug, I have another thing, a question that maybe you have some insight on, because I know very little about the inner workings of the Republican Party. But I'm just wondering about sort of the decent Republicans that are left, the few ones who actually stand up for democratic values, or even people like the Lincoln Project who actively campaigned, or even McCain's widow who, you know, had played a big role. So it seems like there are some Republicans, at least, that are kind of mourning the loss of some democratic values inside the Republican Party. And I'm just wondering if you think there's going to be any kind of move to try to reclaim the party, or now that Trump is out of the way, or what do you think is going to happen there?
Yeah, again, this is such an important question, such an important issue. There are Republicans former Republicans who have left in disgust over the last 4 years, right. And not a trivial number. The interesting thing about Trump is he really did get lots of people to register and vote who had never previously participated in politics. So even you would have thought that if there was a fairly significant migration out of the party by disaffected establishment Republicans, that the Republicans would have really been in deep trouble in 2020, and yet they polled 73 million. So he pulled more people in than exited.
Right.
Okay. And then, so let's talk about those who voted for Trump. Are there some who are now sort of disillusioned with him, and especially his behavior after the election? Yes, but not many. Latest poll that I saw, which was yesterday, was 88% of those who voted for Trump are convinced the election was stolen.
Right.
Even though Republican election officials all over the country insist this was the most secure election in history.
Right.
So there isn't much erosion yet. I think what it would take is for serious damage to be done to Trump over the next 2-3 years. He faces enormous legal challenges. And if he is in fact found guilty on a host of the charges that will be brought against him, possibly some of his followers will cease to be very enthusiastic about him, and his support will sort of dissipate. But I wouldn't count on that. I mean, he has been involved in legal troubles his whole life. Right. He kind of thrives on lawsuits. He has all his lawyers out there. I think he's likely to remain looking like a powerful figure, pointing to 2024. And his narrative will simply be, see, it's a witch hunt, they're hounding me. It continues to be kind of this political witch hunt that we saw with the Russia investigation. As long as he keeps his followers, his base largely intact, there is no room for the establishment Republicans to try to rebuild the party.
Okay.
If, on the other hand, Trump gets damaged sufficiently so that he seems to be a spent political force, then I think you'd start to see some Republicans move back to the center with a more moderate appeal.
And there's no charismatic kind of Republican potential galvanizing counter-Trump force in the party that is likely to emerge.
No, I don't see it. And again, as long as we have the same nomination process, low turnout caucuses and primaries, it's going to play to the movement wing of the party.
Right.
The kind of person I fear is a Ted Cruz, who at some level is kind of charismatic. He's much more savvy than Trump, and he would appeal to Hispanic voters, at least some Hispanic voters. That's where I would think the party is likely to go 4 years from now. And it's quite likely that that could be successful, especially if the progressive coalition has splintered and expressed opposition to Biden.
Right.
Thank you.
Which means we should all renew our meds. We should get more subscriptions, antidepressants. And
So we have no rejoicing. Our rejoicing is going to be very short-lived, I think.
I fear that's right.
Thank you.
I think we can collect one more question. Maria Kuzis wanted to ask something. Maria, you.
Thank you very much, Guya, for organizing this, and thank you very much, Doug. It's great to hear you again. I enjoyed the lecture, and we have a lot of information on the political dimension. I just wanted to hear you say something, even with the limited time we have, on the media context as part of the environment, because as Mario said, in terms of cultural or the socioeconomic context raised, as well as the identity, where is the role for the media? How do you see that dimension?
Yeah, Maria, that's a great question. I can't see you, but I can hear you. I remember meeting you in, I think, Berlin.
Yeah.
Back in 1992 or something.
Right.
And it followed your work since. The media context, is a huge part of the story. We talk about it some in Deeply Divided. I didn't get into the talk today, but 40 years ago, 30 years ago, essentially most Americans got their news and information, civic information, political information from 3 mainstream television networks and major mainstream daily newspapers. So yes, there were divisions in the country, but there was a kind of shared media discourse. People really did more or less live in the same media environment, same media universe. And obviously that's not true at all. And that's true on the left and the right. I mean, I'm not saying anything original. All of us know this. Information is now incredibly siloed. That's why 88% of those who voted for Trump can honestly believe that the election was stolen. So it makes it very hard to rebuild a civil middle in the United States or many other countries, because all of us, most of us, are attuned to very specific sources of information which tend to reinforce our own political views and distance us from those of our opponents. And obviously that's not going to change in the US. In fact, one of the best guesses about what Trump's going to do is he's going to set up his own media enterprise, and he's going to be polluting the airwaves with his unique brand of conspiracy theories and racist discourse, which is just going to make the American media environment that much more contentious.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria and Adam. So we are almost at the end. If there is some more questions. I have a really small question if I take advantage of these last minutes. So I don't know very well United States politics, especially central politics, but I know a little bit of local politics. And the case of New York City, for instance, I think that we have many Americas, many United States in the United States. And my question is, for what I know, in the city of New York, there are a lot of, it's a city with a crazy, incredible structural problems and racialized problems, but with also incredible resources to deal with these problems. And these resources were built through also social conflict along the history of the city. My field of studies in this moment is housing, and the protection of tenants in New York City and in the states of New York is really strong in respect to other contexts. And with a legislation that was really the result of struggle in housing during years. and with also the community organizations and a very, very dense network of different actors involved in the field of housing, but maybe in many other fields. So my question is, okay, we can see this deconstruction of American democracy that you mentioned, this kind of global, but what at the local level? There are cities, or at least certain cities, more resourceful to face this deconstruction of, or at least this attempt of deconstructions? This is my question.
Yeah, I think, you know, the US remains a very decentralized system. And so even in the face of sort of 4 years of Trump, there are certainly many communities in the United States, urban centers in particular, that remain kind of vibrant, progressive political social systems. That said, you know, there are lots of not all progressives, people of color, LGBT live in these urban centers. So you have a lot of vulnerable populations in other red states, red areas, yeah, who essentially have lost, for instance, reproductive rights. Women living in many red areas essentially have no access to abortion. I think the Supreme Court is very likely to overturn Roe v. Wade at some point in the next couple of years anyway. That's going to impact women even in these protected urban centers. Yeah. So it's a real mixed bag. Yes, there are, because of the decentralized nature of America, progressives can wind up living in areas where they're largely insulated from the worst effects of this. But we shouldn't be blind to the costs of the kind of restrictive legislation, conservative legislation that we've been subject to the last 4 years. People are really suffering in this country. Income inequality, wealth inequality is at an all-time high. The pandemic has just exacerbated that. So even if there are pockets of protection in the United States, the cost to American democracy and any sense of social justice and economic justice has largely been disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so there is a very strong rural-urban divide. It's also very common in Eastern Europe here. Well, in Europe, but in general, but in Eastern Europe at this moment,
yes,
it's quite a similar process. Also, in
exactly
the construction of the democracy balances. If we don't have more questions, I think that we can let you free for your starting your day.
Well, I thank you so much, Guya, and everybody. The questions were absolutely spectacular. It's great to see old friends again, Mario. And thank you again for the invitation.
We are really thankful to you for accepting our invitation, for your great talk that stimulated the question actually. And it was also a really great way to end this here. Let's say it's the last session of our of this year, the last session of our seminar for this 2020. It was a very strange year, and it was great to finish in this way and to have you here for this last event.
Let's hope we have an opportunity to see each other face to face in 2021.
Yeah, let's hope we are able to do this in the next month. Let's see. And thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming to this session. Thank you, Tiago, once more. And we send you more information about the seminar. And good luck with take care, and nice Christmas for what is possible. And bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Ciao, Doug. Ciao, ciao.